Fearful Symmetry, Fridays, number 10. This is coming from page 113 at the bottom, just for a few lines, over to page 14. And I took a few notes, and I'm going to share those with you now, and then I'm going to read from Fearful Symmetry by Northrop Frye. So in this section of the book, he's getting into some interesting things about what words are, what language is, and what poetry is. And this is going to be very important, actually, coming up for this video I'm doing on truth, which is part of my Jordan Peterson Paradox series. And it's such a big topic that I've been putting it off because it just goes on forever, and I want to cut it down to size and make it understandable, trying to make Heidegger understandable. But anyway, so here's William Blake and Northrop Frye commenting on William Blake. And so he says, all creative power is human and not natural. I thought that was kind of interesting. It reminds me of the stuff you might hear on Vanderklay's channel when he's talking about C.S. Lewis and the power of reason and logic and that kind of thing, is that might be supernatural. Here Blake and Frye are saying all creative power is human and not natural. Nature has no pattern except that which the mind gives it. Now this is interesting because this is something that you might hear a hardcore atheist say, that there is no pattern that we're seeing or design in the universe. That's only put there because your mind sort of has to put those patterns on the world in order to understand it in some way. It also reminds me of Jung's famous saying, in every chaos there is a cosmos. So Jung sort of looked for that order in the chaos, and he was able to find it wherever he looked. Words are instilled with meaning from the minds of individuals and not the outside world. This is another thing that's kind of contentious, kind of not contentious. And this is where it's going to get interesting, and this sort of reflects back on the essay on truth and lies that I covered by Nietzsche in my metaphor and epistemology video. Because what are words anyway? And this goes back to Sam Harris. He's using language, he's using words, but does he? I mean, of course, he technically knows what words he's using and what they mean, as in their definitions, and we're going to get to that, I think, in the next slide, and maybe in the reading here, this definitional sense. I've been reading so many things lately, I don't know which book I read it in. Maybe it wasn't this book at all, but well, we'll find out. Okay, the Baconian ideas of language are, here we go, definitional, general, and universal. And this is just not the case. You're not going to get Shakespeare out of a dictionary. And this is something that I think it's hard for a materialist and people like Sam Harris to understand about language. Words and meanings depend on context and relations of betweenness, and I'm using this betweenness. You might hear me use it a lot. I'm pulling that from McGilchrist, Ian McGilchrist, and The Master and His Emissary. I also reference that a lot because it's a great companion book to Maps of Meaning and to Jordan Peterson in general, just as I think Northrop Frye is a great commentary, and William Blake is very great to read if you want to understand more about the roots of Jordan Peterson's thoughts. So the words themselves, and your sentences and your poetry that we're going to be talking about, it's all about not what is concretely and absolutely found in the dictionary, that this certain word will mean this in every single case, but it's very contextual, on what's around it and how you're saying it, and this is where you get into your human relational being. And there's a lot of things that go into it that we can't exactly pin down, and when you do try to pin it down, when you start to explain a joke, for example, that's a good example. When you try to explain a joke, it loses its power, it loses its funniness, it loses the humor, just is sapped right out of it. The humor is in the betweenness. It's in the being there in relation to everybody in the room, whoever's hearing it, between the two people, maybe the comedian and the person hearing it. And it's sort of in the ether, and once you have to start to explain it, it loses its punch. And I'm reminded of this great little bit I saw on YouTube of Norm Macdonald sort of giving it to a heckler. And one of the things he did, and he's so clever, is that she tried to use humor against him. So she kind of said that he never has seen a treadmill, and so she's making a joke back at him. And it took her a while to come up with this, which is part of why what he does is so funny. He then pretends he doesn't understand the joke. He doesn't get it. And so he keeps pretending he doesn't get it and making her explain more and more of the joke. And ultimately he never gets it. And so after like 5 minutes of her trying to explain the joke, she's the one who looks foolish and not him. So he's brilliant. But this is also part of the betweenness that I'm talking about. So the poet, for the poet, words are storm centers. This is mostly quoted right from the book. These are just interesting lines, I thought. Storm centers of meaning. Words are storm centers of meaning. I thought that's an interesting little phrase Frye used there. And then I think on page 115, there's a couple of things I thought were interesting. Words in poetry have an intensity and meaning that no dictionary can approach. We kind of just went over that. Words in poetry have a revelatory quality which doesn't exist in prose. And this is where you're going to see sort of the biblical narrative kind of emerging out of good art and out of poetry. Now 115 to 117, those pages I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover tonight, but I thought they were kind of interesting as well. It's where he covers meaning and allegory. I might dip into that without being able to finish it tonight, as I want these videos, these Fearful Symmetry Friday videos, to be kind of on the shorter side of things and not end up being like a 40 or 60 minute video. Now I have a little note I made on the screen because as I was doing this, I didn't want to forget this, but it sort of plays in, and it plays into something I'm working on, like I said, about truth, that I hope to put up tomorrow. And again, I hope to keep it within 30 or 40 minutes so it's not too unapproachable. But someone you might hear on Vanderklay's channel a lot is N.T. Wright. So he's a pretty famous New Testament scholar. And I have a book that compiles sort of a bunch of essays that he has. Well, first he puts forward his ideas about the resurrection of Jesus, and then various scholars all respond to his ideas. And so it's sort of like a conversation about his ideas about the resurrection. And so they'll go back and forth, pro and con, over his arguments. And it's a real interesting exercise to see both sides of the coin instead of just a presentation of one side. But so what I'm seeing is a sort of rational exercise in the book. And a lot of these are, of course, they're Christian scholars. They're actually scholars who are not just scholars, but they're believers as well. And they're going over the arguments. They're going over the fine points of logic. And they're going over the history with a fine-tooth comb as far as that can be done. And they're going over the sort of philosophical background of this, because none of this exists outside a philosophical backdrop. And if you're an avid listener to or watcher of Paul Vanderklay, he recently brought up C.S. Lewis going over this old English book for children or something, and C.S. Lewis just tears into it about the presuppositions that these supposed teachers had been building into their book that wouldn't be consciously taken up by young children reading it, but it would be forming their worldview. And once you have your worldview is not necessarily always consciously formed, or you're even consciously aware of it. It's more of an unconscious thing than it is a conscious thing, as is much of our being. So there's the philosophy that goes into analyzing the history of the resurrection, and there's an interesting quote from the Introduction to Christianity by Ratzinger, and he talks about faith as a calling and responding to a call. This is the word, responding to the verbal sense, or the auditory sense of the word, and that's a metaphor most times. And so there's this idea of the spoken word hearing that which is, and that which is is the truth. And this gets back to a little bit of Heidegger, which interestingly enough, Ratzinger gets into as well. It's sort of a coincidence that I'm doing this video. I was asked to read the book. I'm reading the book, and then I was also on the side reading this piece by Heidegger, and Ratzinger sort of is dripping in, thoughts from Heidegger, and I'm sensing some Karl Barth as well, and it's all sort of just coming together. Hopefully the video will put things in perspective nicely. But so what I'm seeing in this book with N.T. Wright is more about a philosophy than it is about a faith, and it's more about logic and reason, which William Blake would say is the God he named your reason. It's a play on words there. He's very punny, and it's not necessarily the Christian God, which I got into a little bit in I think part 3 of the Jordan Peterson Paradox video series, where I introduced the debate between I think his name is Michael Roos and John Lennox, where Michael Roos is talking about the metaphorical. He's talking about things that you might think a Christian might emphasize, but they tend not to in these kind of debates. And what I want to emphasize is the ultimate thing that a Christian should emphasize and use in these kind of debates or anywhere is the love relationship with Jesus. And so what Ratzinger says, and maybe I should have pulled up the quote for this video, but he says that philosophy depends on you thinking and rethinking and sort of assembling an argument line by line, word by word, and you're kind of working it over, and then you're writing it down, and maybe you're speaking about it to someone, you're maybe vocalizing it. But it's very much internal. It's very much singular to you, and it revolves around you and your brain, and your thoughts, your mind, and not someone else. It's not communal, and it's about the word does not exist before you think about it. You think, and then you come up with you create that word, the words which you want to use, and so that kind of reminded me of as Jesus as the ultimate, quote, no assembly required. So there's it's not like philosophy and what you're going to see in a lot of even New Testament scholarly work. They're the building blocks, like Paul Vanderklay say. They want to build the blocks, set them up, construct this thing. Jesus does not require assembly. He is the truth. He precedes our thoughts. He precedes our constructions. And it's a matter of listening and obeying, as Ratzinger gets into. So yeah, I'm really enjoying the Ratzinger book, Introduction to Christianity, and it's sort of seeped into my work here with William Blake and Northrop Frye. But I thought it was valuable to mention, and it sort of gives me a chance to kind of speak about this before I talk about it in the video on truth. So I'm going to reverse slides here because I only have 2 for today, and we'll see how far we can get in this talk about how Northrop Frye talks about William Blake's poetry and about the meaning of words and so forth. All right, so he says, Blake says very little about diction in poetry, and our account of his ideas on this point will have to take the form of a conjectural reconstruction, but the poet who said, and apparently meant, that, quote, poetry admits not a letter that is insignificant, must have had strong feelings about it. Those who accept the Baconian and Lockean principle that words are the spectral ghosts of real things existing outside the mind will be hampered by several misconceptions, which will forever prevent them from understanding what poetry is and why it exists. It is characteristic of people with vague minds and wandering attentions to speak of literature as, quote, just a lot of words, end quote, meaning that words are inadequate and misleading substitutes for real things which the weakness and opacity of our minds compel us to adopt. But the assumption is false. If a tree fell in an uninhabited forest, would there be any sound? If sound means only waves set up in the air, yes. If it means waves set up in the air and striking a mind through its ear, no. But the latter meaning of sound is the only one that has any sense as well as sound. On the same principle, an object that has received a name is more real by virtue of it than an object without one. A thing's name is its noumen, its imaginative reality in the eternal world of the human mind. That is another reason why Jesus is called the Word of God. Reality is intelligibility, and a poet who has put things into words has lifted, quote, things from the barren chaos of nature into the created order of thought. The preacher says wearily that of making many books there is no end. The Apostle John, in the full exuberance of the Spirit released in him by Jesus, proclaims that the world is not nearly big enough to hold all that might be written about the Word. Now, as all creative power is human and not natural, it follows that words are of the pattern of the human mind and not that of nature, though of course nature has no pattern either apart from the mind. Therefore, the meaning of a word does not depend on its relation to an outside world. The Baconian mind strives to make every word reproduce one definite, quote, thing, end quote, or one reflected, quote, idea, end quote, to the exclusion of all others. It is perpetually demanding definition in the sense of establishing a general law for each word that will meet every case. This cannot be done. A word's meaning depends partly on its context and partly on its relation to the mind of its hearer. All general meanings are only approximate. To the poet, the word is a storm center of meanings, sounds and associations radiating out indefinitely like the ripples of a pool. It is precisely because of this indefiniteness that he writes poems. The poem is a unity of words in which these radiations have become the links of an imaginative cohesion. In a poem, the sounds and rhythms of words are revealed more clearly than in ordinary speech, and similarly their meanings have an intensity in poetry that a dictionary can give no hint of. This respect for the imaginative integrity of poetry is the reason for Blake's distrust of set patterns of meter and rhyme. Only lyrics, and not many of them, can be in a strict stanzaic form. Longer works must have much greater fluency if the sound, sense, and subject are to make a complete correspondence at all times. And then it just gets into some technical things, and then into the part about imagery and meaning, which is I really hope to cover today, but this is running a little bit longer than I'd like these videos to run. So maybe next time I'll get into this part about meaning and allegory and so forth, what a proper allegory should mean and how it should mean it. Again, Blake is arguing against Bacon and Locke, and these are the guys that people like Sam Harris sort of look up to. They're in their tradition, the Lockean tradition. And of course it moves on beyond them, but they're certainly reapers of what Locke and Bacon sowed, if you want to look at it that way. And Jordan Peterson is he's reaping the scientific rewards of that, but he's also looking at the great literature for lessons. He's looking towards the Bible for psychological and other kinds of lessons, moral and ethical guidance and so forth. So again, if you like these kind of readings from Fearful Symmetry, if you like William Blake, if you like Jordan Peterson, if you like poetry in general, please like the video and subscribe. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.